Okay, so now we want to talk about demand shocks. Back to our cornflake market. We have our perfectly competitive market. It's got our equilibrium at P0, Q0. When we drew these supply and demand curves to look at the relationship between price and quantity demanded or price and quantity supplied, one of the things that we did was make the assumption that all other factors were going to remain constant. And if those other factors change, then we have a shock, an external shock. Those shocks can be on the demand side or they could be on the supply side. But let's look at the demand side first. So these are the things that have an effect on our demand other than the price of the good. We know that the price of the good itself is the single most important factor. That's what underlines that relationship between price and quantity demanded. But other things that could affect our demand are the preferences and tastes of consumers, the price of goods that are related from a consumer's point of view. Goods can be related as substitutes where they are used in place of each other, like apple juice and orange juice, or they could be complementary goods, goods that are consumed together at the same time, like a computer with software. When the price of the other good changes, it can affect what happens to the demand for the first good, our good. Another thing is the income that consumers have. The income that consumers have, there are really 99% of the time goods are what we call normal goods, which mean when our income rises, demand increases. When our income falls, demand falls. There's a small minority of things that are called inferior goods that behave the opposite. When your income goes up, you demand less, and when your income goes down, you demand more. Used clothing is my example for that. When people's incomes go up, they demand less used clothing. When their income falls, they demand more. The market size just refers to, the total number of consumers in the market. If you've got 1 billion consumers or you have 100, that makes a difference in our demand. And then last but not least, we have expectations that consumers have about the future price of the product or about their future income. If they believe the future price will be higher, they're going to consume more now before the price rises. If they think the price will fall, they're going to demand less now, wait for the new lower price. Future income, if I think my income is going to go higher, I tend to spend more freely today, and that would increase demand. If I think my income is going to be lower in the future, then I'm going to tighten my belt and actually demand less. So here are a couple of examples. Let's say that we get this first statement. Research shows that eating cornflakes prevents baldness. Well, I'm going to interpret that as a change in consumer preferences. And since most people prefer to not be bald, this would be a positive change. And we would show a positive change on our demand curve by shifting the entire demand curve to the right. We don't move along the demand curve because we didn't change the price of cornflakes. What changed was one of these other conditions, the preferences and tastes of consumers. Because it's a positive change, we shift to the right. Right is always more, left is always less. So a positive increase in demand when we get that positive change in consumers' preferences because they've now learned that it prevents baldness. Puffed rice rises in price. So when you're thinking about cornflakes, puffed rice would be a substitute cereal. If the price of my substitute cereal, puffed rice, goes up, that means more consumers are going to want cornflakes. Again, a positive change, causing demand to shift to the right, increase. Third and final, consumer income fall, and cornflakes are an inferior good. As we said a minute ago, this is like the used clothing, right? If our incomes go down, and cornflakes are an inferior good, that actually means that demand is going to increase again and shift to the right. Notice that anytime demand shifts to the right, the market is going to rise to a new higher equilibrium price and quantity following the change. That will always be true. Now, if we look at some things on the other side, let's say that consumer income falls and cornflakes are a normal good. Well, then, of course, that means that income has gone down. Cornflake demand would go down. So how do we show a decrease in demand? We're going to shift the entire demand curve to the left. Left is less. It's a negative change. Notice the new equilibrium price and quantity are both lower. If consumers see an increase in the price of milk, so what's the connection between milk and cornflakes? They are complementary goods. They're consumed together, right? We usually put milk on our cornflakes. So if the price of milk goes up, what we're saying is that's going to cause a decrease in the demand for cornflakes. The price of cornflakes didn't change. What changed was the price of its complement, milk. And with a new higher milk price, consumers are going to demand less cornflakes at every price. So again, left is less. We get a new lower price and equilibrium quantity. And then again, an expectation. If consumers expect cornflakes to go on sale next week, well, if I think they're going to be cheaper next week, I can wait till next week. So again, this is the graph for the present. Right now, today, we're going to buy fewer cornflakes because we're going to wait till the price of cornflakes falls, and then we're going to buy them. So this negative change again is a leftward shift, a decrease in demand, and brings about a new lower price and quantity. One last thing to notice before we leave this is that when demand shifts, we're also moving along the supply curve. So we call this shift a change in demand, and we call the movement along the supply curve a change in the quantity supplied, because it wasn't a factor of supply that changed. We're simply moving to a new price along the same supply curve. So movements along the same curve are always called a change in quantity, either supplied or quantity demanded. If the demand curve or the supply curve shifts entirely, then it's a change in demand or a change in supply. I know it sounds very picky, but you need to be very specific because economists mean very specific things when they're using these terms to describe those changes.